The story begins with a man named Brian walking into a small electronics store. Inside, he purchases a karaoke machine. After buying it, he carefully wraps it in colorful gift paper. Then he arrives at a large house where a formal birthday party is taking place. As he walks toward the area where gifts are being collected, a security guard stops him and asks him to leave the present there. Soon after, Brian's ex-wife Lenore approaches. She reminds him of the party rules and asks him to follow them. Brian explains that he wants to give the present directly to Kim. Before the discussion continues, Kim sees him from across the yard and runs over to greet him. Kim runs over and hugs her father. She unwraps the present, finding a karaoke machine inside, and looks pleased. Lenore, however, appears unsure about the gift. When she questions it, Brian explains that Kim enjoys singing. Then, Brian takes a photo of her holding the machine. A moment later, Kim notices her stepfather, Stuart, bringing out a horse. She puts down the karaoke machine and rushes over. She gets on the horse and begins riding around the yard as Brian watches from a distance. After getting back home, Brian develops photos from Kim's birthday and adds one to an album where he's kept pictures from her previous birthdays. Shortly after, the doorbell rings. A few of his former colleagues arrive with food and drinks. Brian looks slightly surprised, but they remind him it's his turn to host. He lets them in. Later, they gather outside as Brian grills steaks. Through their conversation, it becomes clear they all once worked together, possibly in intelligence or security. Before leaving, one of the men suggests that Brian consider returning to work. With Kim getting older and preparing for college, they point out that he may have more time on his hands. Brian eventually agrees to take on a short-term security job. He joins his former team to provide protection for a well-known singer. At the venue, they escort her through crowds, keeping a close watch as she signs autographs and interacts with fans. Brian is assigned to remain with her in the makeup room during preparations. While the singer warms up with her vocal coach and gets her makeup done, Brian compliments her voice and introduces himself. As she prepares to leave, he asks for advice about becoming a singer, mentioning his daughter's interest. She responds briefly, suggesting it's not an easy path. After the show, the singer is with her security team when a barrier suddenly breaks and a crowd rushes in. Brian quickly grabs her and guides her toward the waiting cars. A man lunges at her with a knife, but Brian reacts immediately, stopping the attacker and getting her safely inside the vehicle. As they drive away, she begins to cry, but Brian comforts her. Outside the hotel, the team divides their payment, joking that Brian still has his skills. Then the singer calls Brian upstairs. She thanks Brian and gives him the contact information for her trusted voice coach and offers to support Kim's singing lessons if she has the skills, even covering the costs. Brian appreciates her kind offer and takes the card. The next day, Brian meets Kim for lunch, and Lenore unexpectedly joins them. Kim shares her excitement about a planned trip to Paris with her friend Amanda. Since Kim is still a minor, both parents need to approve the trip. However, Brian expresses concern about her safety, which upsets Kim, and she leaves before he can give her the coach's contact information. Later, Brian visits their home and gives Kim the signed permission form. She is happy to receive it. Still cautious, Brian provides her with a phone and sets clear rules. She must call when she arrives and check in daily. He also insists on driving her to the airport. On the drive, Brian and Kim discuss his former job. Kim admits she was hesitant to ask about it. Brian explains that he worked to prevent harmful events, and that although it was a good job, he missed being with her more. At the airport, Brian helps Kim with her luggage and notices a map of Europe marked with several concert dates. Lenore confirms that Kim and Amanda are following a band on tour and that Stuart has purchased tickets for them. Brian feels uneasy about the plan, but Lenore insists it's part of growing up. Brian hands Kim her bags, takes a quick photo, and watches as she passes through security, waving goodbye. Once in Paris, Kim and Amanda walk through the terminal, taking selfies with their phones. During this, a young man named Peter approaches them, introduces himself, and offers to share a taxi to save money. They accept and leave together. Back home, Brian is developing photos from Kim's birthday. He smiles looking at them, but gets concerned when he calls the airline and finds out Kim's flight has already landed. Yet she hasn't called, like she promised. The taxi drops the girls off at an apartment. Peter asks if this is their stop, and Amanda says yes, adding that her cousins are out of town, so they have the whole place to themselves. Kim is surprised. She thought adults would be there. Before leaving, Peter invites them to a party, but as soon as they leave, he makes a shady phone call. giving away their location and describing the girls. Back home, Brian keeps calling Kim again and again, growing more worried each time. He even calls Lenore, who tells him to let them have their fun. After all, they're in Paris. Finally, Kim finds her phone and sees all the missed calls. She moves to a quieter part of the apartment to call Brian back. He's relieved to hear from her, but Kim shares her doubts about being alone without the cousins. Suddenly, 3 men burst into the apartment and grab Amanda. Kim panics and asks her dad for help. Brian stays calm and asks Kim where she is. He tells her to move to the next room and hide under the bed. Then he warns her that the hard part is coming. She'll have to let the men take her too. But when she does, he tells her to yell out everything she can see about them and leave the phone under the bed. It is revealed that Brian has set up a recorder on his own phone to record everything, hoping to catch clues to identify the men. The men come back into the room looking for Kim. At first, 2 of them talk quietly in a language she doesn't understand. Kim thinks they're leaving, but suddenly, the 3rd man grabs her. She screams and yells for help, but then the phone falls into someone else's hands. Brian answers calmly but firmly, telling them he doesn't have money to pay. Instead, he warns them he has a special set of skills that make him dangerous to people like them. He promises if they let Kim go, he won't come after them, but if they don't, he'll hunt them down. The voice on the other end simply says, "Good luck," and hangs up. Brian immediately calls his old friends and sends them the recording to translate the strange language. Then he rushes to Lenore and Stuart's house. Without wasting time, he goes upstairs and asks Stuart if any of his secretive business deals could have led to this. Stuart denies it, surprised and upset. Brian tells them Kim has been kidnapped. Lenore breaks down in tears. Then, Brian starts searching Kim's room, and Stuart asks if there's anything he can do. Brian tells him that he needs a private plane to Paris. Lenore begs Brian to get Kim back, but Brian says first he has to find her. While searching, Brian's friend calls back with the translation. The kidnappers spoke Albanian, and the leader's name is Marco. He's a major player in human trafficking, especially of women, and has been active in Paris for some time. Brian learns he has only 96 hours from the time Kim was taken to find her, or he may never see her again. On a private plane to Paris, Brian listens to the recordings over and over, hearing that chilling "good luck" again and again as he prepares for what's ahead. Brian arrives in Paris and heads straight to the apartment building where Kim was taken. When he reaches the right floor, he finds the door locked tight. Without hesitation, he climbs outside along a narrow ledge and breaks a window to get inside. Once inside, Brian thinks back to everything that happened during Kim's abduction, first from his own perspective, then imagining how his daughter must have felt. On the floor, he finds the broken phone and spots the memory card still inside. He takes it with him. Later, at a small kiosk, Brian inserts the memory card and looks through the photos. One picture catches his attention, the one Peter took. Zooming in, he notices Peter's reflection in a nearby window, revealing more than just a friendly face. Meanwhile, Peter and another man are back at the airport, trying the same trick to lure another woman. Brian surprises them and attacks Peter, who quickly runs off. The big man pulls Brian away, and the 2 men fight. Brian shows off his impressive skills, taking the man down fast. Then, he chases after Peter. After a long and intense pursuit, Peter makes a risky jump off a bridge and lands safely. For a brief moment, he looks back at Brian, but just then, a truck appears and hits Peter, ending the chase suddenly. Then, we see a man step out of a police station in Paris. He looks like a detective or some kind of officer. Brian spots him sitting at a nearby cafe and decides to follow him. They start talking, and it's clear they know each other from before. The man, named Jean-Claude, listens as Brian explains his situation. Jean-Claude is behind a desk now, while Brian is supposed to be retired. But everything changed when his daughter was taken. Jean-Claude is upset that Brian got one of his people killed during the search. He warns Brian not to cause too much chaos in Paris. But Brian is determined, saying he'd tear down even the Eiffel Tower if it meant getting Kim back. They talk about the Albanian gang involved in the kidnapping, and Jean-Claude says there are many Albanians in the city and they're dangerous. He gives Brian a lead to start with, and Brian heads off. After Brian leaves, Jean-Claude sets up surveillance to follow him. Brian meets with a translator on a street corner. He tells the translator to stay in the car while he goes to talk to a woman working nearby. Brian tries to get information, but soon a pimp shows up, pushes Brian against a wall, and demands money. Brian pays quietly, but while doing so, he secretly plants a bug on the pimp's collar. Back in the car, the translator listens in on the conversation and translates some of what he hears. They're talking about a construction site and some fresh merchandise causing problems. Brian doesn't wait to hear more. He pushes the translator out of the car and speeds away. In the next scene, Brian stands in a line with other men, each paying money to get a small card with a number on it. He follows the number to a row of stalls, and behind each curtain is a woman in a tiny hidden room. One woman with drugged eyes and track marks on her arms catches his attention and gestures for him to come closer. Brian turns away and starts opening curtains one by one. He finds many girls with men, but no sign of Kim. At last, he spots a jacket on the floor in one of the rooms. It looks like Kim's, but the girl wearing it isn't her. Brian gets angry, beats up the man with her, and tries to ask the girl where she got the jacket, but she's too drugged to answer. Suddenly, guards rush in. Brian fights fiercely, taking down 3 of them with his bare hands. He grabs a gun from one guard and fires at the others. Then, Brian grabs the girl with the jacket and puts her in his car, but they're quickly chased by a group of Albanian men. The attackers shoot at his car, but Brian speeds away. To further slow them down, Brian crashes into drums of gasoline, causing a big explosion. He uses the chaos to roll one truck down a dirt slope. Another he drives into a light pole. Then, his fast driving forces a third truck into a bulldozer, ripping its roof off. After this, Brian crashes through a small construction shed before finally escaping. Meanwhile, Jean-Claude is talking with some people, warning them that Brian is causing too much trouble and should leave Paris before things get worse. On the other hand, Brian realizes he's being followed and manages to lose his tail. He heads to a hotel where the staff recognize him and quickly gets a room for himself and the girl. To be safe, he hotwires another car to throw off any followers. Inside the room, he sets up a simple IV drip and gives the girl some medicine to help counteract the drugs she was given. Brian is exhausted as he's been awake for about 24 to 30 hours and tries to get some rest. Suddenly, Jean calls him, asking to talk. Brian calls Jean back at a park. Jean tells him that his reckless actions have caused problems, and he needs to return to the United States immediately. However, Brian refuses to leave. Meanwhile, the police are tracking Brian's phone and moving in with a SWAT team. When they find the phone, it's just sitting next to a two-way radio relaying from somewhere else. But Brian himself is watching the scene from a distance with binoculars. Back in the hotel room, Brian is copying words from an Albanian dictionary. The girl wakes up, scared and pulling at the IV, but Brian calms her down and asks about the jacket. She says she got it from a kind girl, and Brian explains that's his daughter. Then, the girl remembers and tells him the street and the color of the door where they were kept, recalling it from flashbacks of when she was taken. Brian goes into the area and introduces himself as Jean-Claude, showing the business card he received from his old friend. The Albanians lead him upstairs to a kitchen, where several of them are gathered around a table. He acts like he's there to negotiate a new payment for police protection or silence. After some back and forth, they hand him some money. While watching them, Brian notices a tattoo on one man's hand, and it looks like the same tattoo Kim screamed out during her kidnapping. As they continue talking, one of the men says, "Good luck," with a familiar voice, the same one from the tape Brian had heard before. Brian scans the room and asks if anyone recognizes him. The man with the tattoo says no. Suddenly, Brian attacks. He starts fighting and shooting through the place, killing everyone except the man who helped kidnap his daughter. That man is stunned, but alive. After clearing the building of the other Albanians, Brian searches the rooms. He finds more girls tied up, drugged and scared. One room holds Amanda, but she's dead, with signs of overdose nearby. However, Kim is not there. Brian ties the stunned man to a chair. Using 2 large construction nails, he drives them into the man's thighs and clips battery cables to the nails. He asks again where Kim is, but the man spits in Brian's face. Brian flips the light switch connected to the cables, causing the man to convulse in pain. He asks again, but the man spits on him once more. Brian leaves the shock on longer this time. Finally, Brian warns that he'll kill the man if he doesn't talk. Finally, the man gives in and says Kim was sold to someone named St. Clair. Brian checks and confirms that is a person's name. Leaving the man screaming in pain, Brian switches the shock on one last time and walks out of the building. Meanwhile, Jean returns home to find Brian sitting at the dinner table with Jean's wife. It's clear these men all know each other well. Jean quietly goes to the bathroom to grab a hidden gun. As they eat, Brian accuses Jean of helping the Albanians in exchange for money. Jean admits he takes a cut and he needs the cash. Then, Jean pulls out the gun and points it at Brian, but Brian calmly reveals the gun is empty. He says Jean must be rusty if he can't tell the difference. Suddenly, Brian shoots Jean's wife, but says it's only a flesh wound. He warns Jean that if he doesn't help, the next shot will be fatal. Under pressure, Jean looks up information about St. Clair, but before Jean can react, Brian knocks him out and leaves. Using Jean's ID, Brian gets into a party at St. Clair's estate. Inside, he spots St. Clair entering a private elevator. Brian kills the guard and follows him down. Below, Brian sees rooms where men are bidding on women being shown on stage. A waiter approaches, but Brian kills him and takes his champagne. He walks into a booth where a man is bidding on a woman, serving him the champagne quietly in the dim light. Kim is the last girl shown as the special one. Brian pulls a gun on the bidder and forces him to win. As Brian escorts the man out, a thug hits Brian over the head, knocking him out. Brian wakes up with his hands chained to a water pipe above him. St. Clair stands nearby, asking who he is. Brian says he's Kim's father. After hearing this, St. Clair says it's just business and orders his men to kill Brian quietly. But Brian breaks free, pulling down the pipe and spraying hot steam on the men. He fights back fiercely, killing all of them, including a guard sent by St. Clair to investigate the noise. After Brian has taken out all the men, he finds St. Clair in the elevator. Brian shoots him in one arm and demands to know where Kim is. When St. Clair gives him a location, a pier where she's on a boat, Brian shoots him again, this time in the other arm and the leg. St. Clair insists it's just business, but Brian empties the rest of the gun into him before walking away. At the pier, Brian spots Kim being loaded onto a large yacht sailing down the river. He jumps into his car and speeds after the boat. After some wild driving, he reaches a bridge just in time to jump onto the yacht. Inside, Brian fights his way through the guards. It is revealed that the man Brian forced to buy Kim is the main bodyguard, sent to protect the sheik who wants the girls. After a fierce battle with knives and broken glass, Brian finally kills the guard. Brian then finds the sheik holding a large knife to Kim's throat. The sheik tries to negotiate, but Brian ends it quickly with a shot to the head. Kim, shocked but relieved, runs to hug her father, crying tears of joy. Back home, as they arrive through the gates, Kim runs to hug her mother and stepfather. Lenore thanks Brian with a long hug, and Stuart offers Brian a ride home, which he politely declines. The final scene shows Kim and Brian standing outside a door. The singer from earlier opens it, with her voice coach nearby by a piano. She asks Kim if she still wants to be a singer. Kim nods, walks inside, and looks back at her father with gratitude. Sometimes later, in Albania, a truck drives through the mountains to a village called Tropoje. A man named Murad, who appears to be their leader, tells the villagers and his family that a man killed their sons and brothers, and that the killer will be brought to Tropoje for justice. Meanwhile, we see Brian Mills, who is working at a car wash and going about his normal life. At exactly 2 p.m., he visits Lenore to let her know he's there for Kim's driving lesson. However, she tells Brian that Kim isn't home, as she is out with her boyfriend Jamie. Then, she offers Brian to come inside. As Brian and Lenore share a drink, Lenore tells him that she and Stuart have separated. Brian comforts Lenore before heading out to find Kim, but Lenore tells him to let her have some privacy. After this, Brian heads to Jamie's place and knocks on the door. A moment later, Jamie opens the door and welcomes Brian inside. Kim, however, is clearly unhappy with her father for invading her privacy and quickly leaves. During their drive, Kim tells Brian that no one knows where Jamie lives. So how did he find them? Brian reveals that he has secretly placed a GPS tracker on Kim's phone. Kim explains that she feels traumatized from past events, and that Brian's constant surveillance only adds to her stress. Despite this, she eventually calms down and reassures her father that she understands his intentions. Then, she tells him she loves him, but warns him not to overstep like this again. Once Kim is out of sight, Brian immediately asks his friend Sam to run a background check on Jamie. That night in Paris, Jean-Claude arrives at his office and sends his guard upstairs. As he picks up a letter, someone follows him, but Jean-Claude soon discovers his man dead. He draws his gun, ready for a fight, but before he can react, a gunman attacks him from behind and knocks him out. Jean-Claude soon wakes up surrounded by men who are questioning him repeatedly about Brian's whereabouts. Despite their pressure, Jean-Claude insists he doesn't know, which only leads to more discomfort and pain. One of the men shows him Brian's business card. the same one Brian used to infiltrate the trafficking ring and kill Murad's son. He tells him that the man Brian killed was his brother, and he will find him at any cost. Back in Los Angeles, we see Brian as he waits for his daughter. At exactly 2 p.m. again, he heads towards the door, and when the door opens, he finds Lenore in tears. She tells Brian that she had planned a trip with Stuart and Kim, but Stuart canceled everything without explanation. She calls Stuart a coward and looks visibly upset. Brian offers her support, including a place to stay if she needs it. Later that night, Brian shares the story with his friends, who tease him and say there's no more tension between him and Lenore. Meanwhile, in Trapoja, we see Suko, the man who tortured Jean-Claude earlier. Suko gives money to a government official to track Brian's movements, and the official reveals that Brian is headed to Istanbul. In Istanbul, Brian is working as a security guard. He calls Lenore to talk with her and Kim, and is thrilled when he learns they have followed him there as a surprise. Brian is initially confused about how they found him, but then discovers that his friend Sam might have given them some inside information. Brian escorts Lenore and Kim to their new residence, which has a beautiful view. After helping them settle in, he returns to finish his work. Meanwhile, Murad and his men travel from Albania and arrive in Istanbul, just as Brian finishes his day and packs up his weapons and gear. Brian returns to Lenore and Kim, where Lenore mentions she just wants to relax and take a bath. Meanwhile, Kim and Brian plan to spend some time alone together. Surprisingly, Brian takes Kim to a club. Afterward, they go on a boat cruise, during which Brian shares bits of history with Kim, trying to teach her about the world beyond their immediate concerns. During the cruise, Brian gently questions Kim about her relationship with Jamie, wanting to understand how serious it is. Kim downplays the relationship, saying it means nothing compared to her feelings for her father and mother. Meanwhile, the Albanian gang members meet with Suko. Murad asks if everything is prepared as requested, showing the seriousness of their plan. He then enters an abandoned building, where his men stand ready for action. At the hotel where Brian is staying, an Albanian lookout calls Murad to report that Brian is about to leave. Brian stops for a moment, sensing he's being watched, and confirms that he knows they are onto him before heading out. Meanwhile, Lenore and Kim meet up with Brian, and Kim says she wants to relax by the pool, hoping to give her parents some time alone. As they walk away, another lookout calls Murad and informs him that Kim is staying there alone. Later, Lenore and Brian have a serious and heartfelt conversation about their relationship, with Lenore acknowledging how much Brian has changed and become more focused on family. Unaware that they are being followed, Brian and Lenore continue driving. However, Brian soon notices the tail and confirms it by having the driver take a different route. He tells Lenore to stay calm as they lose the pursuers. Brian then instructs her that once the car stops, she should head in a specific direction, alert security, and hide in her room until he returns. Lenore, panicked, tries to focus and follows his instructions as the car comes to a stop. Brian takes over driving, but Murad's men are alerted to Brian spotting them, and a car chase begins. Brian tries calling Kim, but she doesn't answer. He stops the car in an alley but is still spotted and comes under fire, getting trapped between two vehicles. The Albanian thugs jump out of their cars with guns drawn, only to find the vehicle empty. Meanwhile, Lenore runs into a locked gate and gets trapped. Brian, on the other hand, sprints away, with the thugs chasing him on foot. Knowing the area better, Brian leads one of the men into a narrow alley and quickly takes him down. When two more attackers come at once, Brian skillfully handles them both. Just as two more join the fight, Brian and one of the Albanians end up pointing guns at each other. At that moment, Lenore is dragged into the situation. Brian calls Kim again, who finally answers. He warns her that he's about to be captured and urgently instructs her to go to a specific room and hide in a particular closet right away. Brian ends the call and breaks his phone just as he surrenders to the Albanians. They throw him to the ground and quickly secure both him and Lenore with bags over their heads. Meanwhile, Kim starts to move quickly. The kidnappers drag Brian and Lenore into a van, but Brian listens carefully to every turn and sound, timing everything with a stopwatch. The Albanians search Kim's room but find it empty. During this, security is alerted and rushed to the 4th floor. Meanwhile, Kim sneaks into her father's room and climbs out the window to escape, while Brian keeps analyzing every detail around him. The van eventually stops at Murad's temporary base. The Albanians enter Brian's room and spot Kim's slippers on the floor. Kim moves to the next room and hides in a closet. The kidnappers begin checking the nearby rooms. One man opens her closet but finds nothing. Another enters a different room and kills a witness, causing the first man to rush out. At the same time, security arrives on the 4th floor, but is quickly overwhelmed and shot by the Albanians. The hotel is immediately put on high alert, ensuring that Kim remains safe for the moment. However, Brian's situation is far more dangerous. Alone and tied up in a room, he begins to carefully use his feet to push a small device out from his pants. After a few attempts, he finally manages to grab it with his hands, and it's revealed to be a hidden phone. Brian calls Kim, and she quickly picks it up. Brian calmly explains the situation to Kim and instructs her to make her way to the U.S. Embassy as quickly as possible. Kim, determined to help, insists on doing more and refuses to stay safe without trying to rescue her parents. Initially, Brian refuses to involve her further, but he reluctantly changes his mind. Leaving the safety of her hiding spot, Kim takes her father's suitcase and unlocks it with the combination. Inside, she finds a variety of important items, including weapons and a detailed map. Using the map, she begins to plot out her next moves, ready to help Brian as best she can from afar. Brian tells Kim to take one of his shoelaces from the closet. Using a pen, she draws a 3-kilometer radius around the hotel on the map, then another 3-kilometer radius around the market. Since these circles don't overlap, Brian instructs her to take a grenade from his suitcase and find an open area to throw it where he can hear the explosion. Kim pulls the pin and tosses the grenade under a car, causing a blast. Brian counts the time it takes to hear it and tells Kim to draw a larger 4.5-kilometer radius around the hotel. This time, 2 circles intersect at 2 points. Kim climbs to a rooftop to observe the direction of the flags in the wind. She relays this to Brian, who then instructs her to head to the eastern point of intersection. He also tells her to bring his pistol and 2 grenades, then wait on a rooftop for his signal. Before the call ends, Brian quickly hides the phone behind his foot. After leaving the room, Kim makes her way to the street and gets in a cab to reach Brian. Meanwhile, Brian is repeatedly punched as Murad enters the room, furious. Murad shows Brian photos of the men Brian killed while trying to rescue Kim. He explains that these men were fathers, husbands, and brothers, and that Brian is responsible for their deaths. Then Murad reveals one photo in particular, of his son, Marco, who was electrocuted to death during Brian's mission. Murad tells Brian that he will be taken to their village for justice. However, Brian dismisses Marco as nothing more than a criminal, earning him a slap. Murad warns Brian that his fate will be neither quick nor painless. Lenore is then dragged into the room, where they cut her with a knife and hang her upside down. The kidnappers say she has about 30 minutes before she bleeds out. Meanwhile, Murad tells Brian that Kim will be found and sold to the lowest of the low. After locking Brian in the room, Murad is informed they have lost track of Kim and decides to go after her himself. Meanwhile, Brian uses his skills to free himself, telling Lenore to stay calm. Kim, following her father's instructions, leaves the cab and makes her way toward the rooftop he designated. Brian cuts himself free, carefully lowers Lenore, and unties her. Once Kim reaches the rooftop, Brian calls her to set off another grenade. She throws it, and this explosion happens much closer. Brian then instructs Kim to move 30 seconds east and throw a second grenade. While Brian manipulates some pipes to create vapor, the Albanians are drawn to the noise. The vapor rising from the pipes helps Kim pinpoint her parents' exact location. Despite seeing that the Albanians are closing in, Kim bravely drops the pistol to Brian. When the Albanians enter, Brian quickly grabs the gun and takes down both of them. Though Lenore is injured, Brian continues fighting, taking out several more Albanians with precise shots. Then, Brian reaches the rooftop just in time to see Kim making a desperate jump to escape. Although one of the pursuers manages to corner her, Brian arrives and rescues his daughter once again. Still shaken, Kim hijacks a taxi, and Brian explains that the men chasing them are after him. He parks the taxi near the spot where Lenore was last seen and sets a 5-minute timer on Kim's phone. He instructs her to head straight to the U.S. Embassy if he doesn't return within that time. After Brian leaves, Kim nervously waits in the taxi. Meanwhile, Brian returns to the building only to find Lenore missing, apparently moved by the Albanians. Police arrive at the scene and place Lenore into a van. Despite Brian's efforts, he is unable to save her. During this, the police inspector calls Murad to inform him of the situation. As the timer on Kim's phone hits 0, Brian shoots the police officer in front of him, jumps into the taxi, and drives off, directing Kim toward the embassy. Police attempt to pull her over, but Kim keeps driving, even though she doesn't have a license. Following her father's instructions, Kim skillfully drives the car through a police chase, even colliding with a few pursuers. The Albanian men try to force them off the road, but with Brian's help, they are quickly taken down. As they speed on, the chase intensifies. They crash through a gate while under fire, and Brian returns shots at their attackers. Approaching a train crossing, Brian urges Kim to accelerate just in time to cross safely, but the Albanians don't make it. Finally, they reach the U.S. Embassy. Despite being shot at, they crash through the gate and come to a stop inside the compound. Brian immediately calls Sam, asking him to alert his contacts to prevent further attacks. He admits his plan was to leave Kim there and ensure these criminals never trouble them again. Meanwhile, Murad enters the room where Lenore is tied up, asking her what he should do with her now that they are on the streets. The next day, Brian retraces his steps to find Lenore. Despite the danger, Lenore still manages to show courage. Meanwhile, Brian is running out of time but stays focused, using his sharp attention to detail to pinpoint exactly where Lenore is being held. Approaching the location, Brian quietly takes out the guard outside and prepares for the final confrontation. He sneaks inside, silently knocking out another thug, then grabs a powerful gun. With impressive precision, Brian takes down 3 more attackers. As Murad's men rush to move Lenore, Brian fights fiercely, sending one thug plummeting 10 stories. The Albanians try to shoot Brian through a wall but fail, dying one by one. Brian makes it clear that anyone threatening his family will pay the price. Meanwhile, Lenore is taken out onto the street, and Brian quickly chases after her. After searching for a while, he finds her lying unconscious on the ground. Just then, Brian and Suko face each other with guns ready, but neither hits their target. They drop their guns and start fighting hand to hand. Both are skilled fighters, trading strong punches and blocks. When Suko pulls a knife, breaking the rules, Brian gets hurt but keeps fighting. Finally, Brian wins by knocking Suko down hard. Brian grabs a gun and one of the bad guys' phones. He calls Murad, but Murad tells Brian he has 2 more sons who want revenge. Brian warns Murad that he needs to stop or face the consequences. However, Murad refuses because he's angry about his son's death. Once again, Brian tells him everyone who loses a child lives with pain and offers a chance for peace if Murad promises to stop fighting. Brian drops his gun and starts to walk away, but Murad grabs the gun and tries to shoot him. The gun doesn't fire because Brian took out the bullet. Seeing that Murad won't change, Brian kills him. Then Brian helps Lenore up and tells her they are safe now. 3 weeks later, Brian waits as Kim takes her driving test. She does very well, and Brian feels proud. To celebrate, they all go to a nice restaurant. Lenore is there, and to Brian's surprise, Kim's boyfriend Jamie shows up too. They all have a nice time together like a family. Next, we see Stuart's accountant searching for his checkbook at home. His wife, in the bathroom, tells him it's downstairs. As he finds the checkbook, a group of armed men enter the house. Their leader, Maxime, forces the accountant to calmly tell his wife that he's taking the dog for a walk. Once outside, Maxime throws him into the trunk of their car. The men drive him to his own office, where mob boss Oleg Malankov is waiting. Malankov explains that Stuart owes him a large sum of money, and since the accountant manages Stuart's finances, he expects the money now. The accountant opens the office safe, but it's empty. Malankov then shoves him into the safe, records a message for Stuart saying he's left him a gift, and shoots the accountant. The next day, Brian buys a large teddy bear as an early birthday gift for Kim, who has recently discovered that she is pregnant. When he visits her apartment to give her the gift, her boyfriend Jamie arrives and jokingly remarks on how predictable both Kim and Brian are. Kim, feeling anxious about her pregnancy, seems unsettled, which Brian misreads as dissatisfaction with the teddy bear. He decides to return it and find something else instead. Later, Lenore calls and teases him about the gift, and the two share a light moment talking about how quickly their daughter has grown up. That evening, while Brian prepares dinner, Lenore shows up at his home looking stressed. She admits that her efforts to repair her marriage with Stuart haven't worked and implies that she might be developing feelings for Brian, but he stops her. Brian, not wanting to interfere in her marriage, gives her a spare key to his house in case she ever needs space while he's away on an upcoming trip. As Brian prepares to leave town for a few days, Lenore forgets her jacket on the way out. Next day, Brian spends time golfing with his old friends. During the game, Kim calls and asks to meet right away. When they meet, Kim is looking for guidance about her pregnancy, but she hesitates to bring it up. Instead, she changes the subject, telling Brian she's thinking about adopting a puppy. Brian, unaware of the real issue, gently scolds her, suggesting she's not ready for that kind of responsibility. That evening, Stuart unexpectedly visits Brian. He notices Lenore's jacket on the couch and quickly becomes suspicious. Stuart tells Brian that if his marriage is to have any chance, Brian must step out of the picture completely. Brian assures him that nothing is going on between him and Lenore, but Stuart doesn't believe him. The next morning, while Brian is out for a jog, he receives a message from Lenore asking to meet urgently. She also requests her favorite bagels. As Brian heads out to pick them up, Maxime watches him from across the street. Brian quickly returns home with the bagels and notices Lenore's car parked outside. As he enters his apartment, he sees a knife on the floor. Then, to his horror, he finds Lenore lifeless on his bed. She has no pulse. Moments later, police officers burst into the apartment responding to an anonymous 911 call. They find Brian at the scene, appearing to be the prime suspect. As they try to arrest him, Brian makes a split-second decision. He disarms both officers, knocks them out, and escapes. A full-scale pursuit follows. Brian sprints across rooftops, scales fences, and dodges gunfire from chasing officers. He eventually breaks into a random home and hides in the garage. Inside, he accesses a hidden compartment that leads to the sewer system. Covered in grime, he sits in silence, shaken by the overwhelming grief of losing Lenore, the woman he once loved deeply. Later, Kim receives a call from Brian. He tells her that Lenore was murdered in his apartment and that someone is trying to frame him. He urges her not to trust anyone, but before Kim can say anything, he ends the call. At the crime scene, LAPD Inspector Frank Dotzler arrives to assess the situation. He examines the blood patterns and the knife and listens as officers explain that an anonymous 911 call claimed a woman was screaming inside. Dotzler notices one of the bagels Brian brought is still warm, meaning the crime happened just moments before the police arrived. Meanwhile, Brian contacts his trusted friend Sam and asks if their old emergency code is still active. Sam confirms it is. Back at the scene, Dotzler walks around the property, puzzled by how Brian managed to vanish so quickly. As he inspects the area near the driveway, he notices a truck parked suspiciously. Moving it aside, he discovers an open utility hatch leading to the city's storm drain and understands Brian's escape route. While Dotzler continues the investigation, Brian heads to an old warehouse. He enters through a hidden back entrance and accesses a secure hideout, a well-equipped safe house he and his former teammates had set up long ago. Inside, Brian arms himself and begins planning his next move, determined to find the people responsible for Lenore's death. At the Mills residence, Dotzler meets with Stuart and expresses his condolences. Upstairs, Kim emerges from Lenore's room in tears. She quietly asks Dotzler if they can postpone further questioning. Understanding the moment, he agrees and instructs Detective Garcia to clear the area. Kim breaks down in front of Detective Dotzler, insisting that her father couldn't have killed Lenore. She tells Stuart to stop blaming Brian and reminds everyone that Brian truly loved Lenore. At the morgue, Stuart tells Dotzler about the previous incidents in Paris and Istanbul involving Brian. He admits he doesn't know every detail, but makes it clear that Brian's life has always been surrounded by danger and high-stakes situations. Dotzler takes it seriously, noting Brian's unusual background, finding out that he joined the army at 21, entered special forces at 23, and then essentially vanished from the record. After this, Dotzler tells his team and tells them that Brian is a ghost, highly trained, unpredictable, and extremely difficult to track. Brian, meanwhile, secretly infiltrates the morgue while police wait outside. He opens Lenore's drawer and looks at her in disbelief. Overcome with emotion, he gently collects a strand of her hair for analysis, then places her back and quietly exits. Back at LAPD, Dotzler instructs his team to monitor Kim closely, believing she might lead them to Brian. He also orders the GPS histories of both Brian and Lenore's vehicles to be downloaded and cross-referenced. But Brian stays ahead of them. He breaks into Lenore's car and extracts the GPS data moments before officers Garcia and another agent arrive. At his hideout, Brian reviews Lenore's location history and spots a suspicious stop, a remote gas station. Disguised as a police officer, he visits the station and questions the receptionist, who doesn't provide much help. He then approaches another worker and asks to view the surveillance footage. While Brian is watching the footage, he sees Lenore being forced into a van, confirming that she was kidnapped. At the same moment, the real officers arrive at the station and begin questioning the receptionist, who unknowingly reveals that Brian was impersonating an officer. Realizing he's been discovered, the officers move to arrest him, catching Brian just as he uncovers the truth. While watching the gas station surveillance footage, Brian notices a distinctive tattoo on the hand of one of Lenore's kidnappers. Before he can act further, two officers arrive and arrest him for Lenore's murder. As they escort him outside in handcuffs, LAPD Inspector Frank Dotzler is alerted to the situation. Realizing Brian allowed himself to be caught on purpose, Dotzler quickly calls Detective Garcia, urging him to stop the police convoy immediately. But Garcia and the others don't take the warning seriously. Meanwhile, in the back of the police cruiser, Brian quietly picks the lock on his handcuffs. He disarms both officers inside the vehicle, ejects one from the car, and forces the other to drive at gunpoint. Meanwhile, Garcia and his team catch up and block the road, drawing their weapons. As the car is hit by other vehicles, Brian forces the officer to continue driving until he finds a safe place to stop. He then kicks the officer out, gains access to the onboard police computer, and downloads vital investigation data onto a flash drive. As the police mobilize, Dotzler joins the pursuit from a helicopter. Multiple patrol cars chase Brian through the city, but his evasive driving skills allow him to stay ahead. When officers attempt to trap him in a parking garage, Brian abruptly stops the car, throws it into reverse, and drops it down an elevator shaft. The car explodes, destroying part of the building and faking his death in the process. While police scramble at the scene, Dotzler receives a call from Brian. He asks for 48 hours to find Lenore's killer and promises to surrender once he has the truth. Dotzler listens in silence as Brian hangs up and discards the phone. Dotzler reviews the gas station surveillance footage with Garcia and is shocked to see that Lenore was abducted by a group of armed men, confirming Brian's claims. Meanwhile, Brian is already ahead, operating from his hidden base. His old friend Sam arrives, and Brian fills him in on everything that's happened. Sam hands over all the LAPD files on Lenore, and Brian gives him a strand of her hair for analysis. At Lenore's funeral, a surveillance van is parked nearby. Inside, Dotzler listens to the interactions around Kim, noting how people comfort her. Sam, working behind the scenes, disrupts the audio feed and tells Kim that her father will be in touch. Realizing Brian is watching through a hidden camera, Kim subtly blows a kiss in its direction. Meanwhile, Dotzler steps out of the van and watches Kim from a distance. Back at home, Kim grows frustrated with the heavy police presence. She confronts Stewart, expressing her resentment. She accuses him of giving Lenore nothing but disappointment for the past 2 years and says she can't even stand to look at him. Then she leaves for college, following her usual routine, just as her father instructed. After parking on campus, Kim turns to Garcia, who has been tailing her, and tells him to stop following. Then she walks into the gas station she visits every morning. Inside, she finds a yogurt drink labeled with a message from her father. Following the instructions, she drinks it and leaves as usual. Later on campus, Garcia listens through the surveillance bug placed on Kim. Suddenly, she tells a friend she feels nauseous and rushes off to the restroom. Concerned, Garcia leaves his car to check on her. Meanwhile, Dotzler visits the gas station and questions the owner about Kim's regular morning visits. Outside the gas station, Dotzler finds the discarded yogurt cup and immediately alerts Garcia that backup is on the way. Meanwhile, Kim heads to the bathroom, where she finds Brian waiting. He quickly locates and disables the surveillance bug on her. Sensing her emotional state, he hugs her, offering comfort. Kim, overwhelmed, confides in her father that she's pregnant. Brian, who has faced armed attackers and high-stakes threats, is visibly more shaken by this news than any danger he's encountered before. Still, he stays composed. She also tells him that Stuart has been acting strange lately, even hiring a private security team, something he never used to do. After this, Brian reattaches the bug to Kim's clothes, allowing her to maintain the appearance of normalcy. Moments later, Garcia bursts into the women's restroom and checks each stall, only to find Kim alone. As Dotzler and his team arrive at the scene, Brian makes his exit. He knocks out a security guard, sets off a small fire, and triggers the building's sprinkler system, using the distraction to escape through the emergency systems undetected. After this, Kim is escorted to a nearby room where Dotzler questions her. She insists that her father is innocent and hands him back the surveillance bug. Meanwhile, at Stuart's office, Stuart tells his security detail that it's time to head to Malibu. He is now worried that Oleg Malenkov is coming after him. As they leave with a full escort, Brian decides to follow the convoy. Suddenly, his car is hit from behind. He tries to maintain control, but another hit sends his vehicle careening off the road. The car flips several times before coming to a stop. Maxim emerges and throws a grenade, intending to finish Brian once and for all. However, they underestimate him. Brian hijacks a passing vehicle and calmly talks with the driver before spotting the car that tried to ram him earlier. Determined to find out who's behind it, he follows the attackers into a bottle shop. Inside, Brian quickly takes down his assailants. He then grabs a pistol. Maxim uses a mirror's reflection to anticipate Brian's movements and fires first. Both men duck low, then engage in close combat. Maxim is tough, but Brian overpowers him. Brian demands to know who hired him, but Maxim refuses to talk and accepts death as the easier choice. Meanwhile, Stuart hears that his friends have arrived. Mistaking them for Maxim and his men, he lets them in, only to be knocked out. He awakens to find Brian standing over him, ready to get answers. Under pressure, Stuart confesses his confusion and asks if the Russians were following him because they worked for him. He denies involvement in Lenore's death, blaming Brian instead. Brian presses for the truth, and Stuart admits he owes money to Oleg Malenkov and that Malenkov targeted Lenore. He also reveals that Lenore was secretly seeing Brian, but he never informed the authorities about it. Then, Brian asks Stuart why Malenkov is chasing him. Stuart explains that he threatened Malenkov by using Brian's name. Brian cuts him off, warning that Malenkov's men are coming after Kim next. Alone in his room, Sam aims his gun at a police officer. Meanwhile, Brian's old crew springs into action. Brian sneaks into a building and swiftly knocks out 2 guards. The last guard falls quickly as well. Kim watches, relieved to see her father, who urges her to leave. At police headquarters, Frank Dotzler briefs his team about Brian's former associates, 4 men who disappeared in their early 20s after serving in the Navy SEALs or Special Forces. They specialized in explosives or communications. The only connection between them is their company, Private Security International. Frank shows the team footage of Maxim's death and notes that he withheld some information. He suspects something strange is unfolding and orders his team to find any of these 4 men, as they might hold crucial knowledge. Back at Brian's base, Brian, Kim, and Stuart agree that Oleg Malenkov must be eliminated to keep Kim safe. Stuart provides background and explains Oleg served in the Russian Army's Special Forces. Then, after the Soviet Union collapsed, he entered the private sector, working in heavy machinery. Their business was profitable until a deal went wrong. During this, Kim loses her temper, blaming Stuart for her mother's death and demanding to kill him. However, Brian intervenes, instructing Stuart to call Oleg and put the call on speakerphone. Oleg answers, and Stuart tells him that the money is ready. He orders Stuart to meet him at his penthouse in an hour. The penthouse has its own private elevator and heavy security. 2 guards at the entrance, plus 3 more inside. After 2 sets of doors, Oleg's private apartment awaits. Sam sneaks into the underground parking lot while Stuart follows him. Soon after, Stuart gets out of his car alongside Brian, and they all enter the van. At that moment, Frank calls Stuart, telling him that Brian has taken Kim. Stuart pretends not to know and says he's in Malibu and needs an hour to get back. Frank ends the call and orders Garcia to track Stuart's location. The team has about half an hour before they are swarmed by officers. Frank immediately alerts the whole cavalry, and they rush to the scene. Brian once again apologizes to his daughter for the chaos affecting her life. Meanwhile, Frank receives an unexpected call from an agent revealing that both Stuart and Lenore had $12 million life insurance policies. Then, Brian hacks into the surveillance system and cuts the live feeds. He takes out the 2 guards stationed at the front entrance. Stuart returns to safety, and Brian's team disables all security cameras. Inside, Brian takes down 3 guards upstairs. Police and henchmen rush to the location, but despite heavy fire, Brian remains unharmed. Creeping toward Oleg's room, Brian is shot at from above, hundreds of bullets raining down. He waits patiently, then puts Oleg in a vulnerable position. Oleg continues firing wildly, forcing Brian to drop to the floor. Then, Oleg pins Brian in a chokehold and beats him with his gun, then points a pistol at him. However, Brian fights back, manages to grab Oleg's gun, and shoots him. Oleg takes his last breaths as Brian stands over him. Oleg laughs and reveals that Stuart tricked them all. He explains that Stuart hired him to kill Lenore, then Brian, and if that didn't work, Stuart planned to send Brian to kill him. Oleg calls Lenore just business and urges Brian to kill him for revenge, but Brian refuses and leaves him alive. Meanwhile, Kim realizes from police data that someone used Brian's phone to arrange Lenore's murder. Realizing he has been caught, Stuart shoots Sam and takes Kim hostage. The police flood the building and find Sam injured but alive. An elevator begins descending, but when the cops check it, it's empty. They move upstairs while Brian hides in a shaft, spotting the dead bodies. The cops lock down the building. During this, Brian sees Sam steal a car and realizes Stuart used his phone the night he came to see him, tracking Kim's location. Brian exits the parking garage while Stuart prepares a private jet to escape. Frank tracks the live location of the Porsche Brian stole and calls him. Brian confirms that Stuart hired the Russians to kill Lenore and himself, and that he won't stop until Kim is safe. At the airport, Kim is taken onto a plane. Brian races in the Porsche, risking his life to save her. Stuart watches in disbelief as Brian speeds toward him. Brian crashes the car into the plane's wheel, preventing takeoff. Seeing no way out, Stuart holds Kim at gunpoint, using her as leverage, but Brian takes a well-aimed shot. Brian tells Stuart everything that happened, and when the police come, Brian stops himself from hurting Stuart, but makes it clear that Stuart will face justice one way or another. Then, Brian knocks Stuart out. Later, Brian meets with Inspector Frank, who says he always believed Brian didn't do anything wrong. Frank explains how he found out the truth by noticing problems in the evidence. Brian thanks Frank and leaves as Frank closes the case. Back with Kim and Jamie, Brian feels very emotional as he holds his unborn granddaughter, thinking about how serious everything is. Kim says if the baby is a girl, they will name her after Lenore, and Brian approves it. This is where the movie ends. Hope you enjoyed it. Do share your thoughts in the comments section. Don't forget to subscribe, and as always, thank you for watching.